All right, so we left off in the previous video discussing the emergence of the American factory. That happens during the market revolution. And again, this is a drastic reorganization of labor that happens within the factory that is in service of increasing productivity and therefore increasing or enhancing profits made by the factory owner, right? And this is something that's new in the history of capitalism. So this happens in America, and then it's just going to explode with what we call the Industrial Revolution, right? But even here in the market revolution, which precedes the Industrial Revolution, you start seeing factories slowly but surely replace the family farm as the sort of central economic unit, right? You start seeing factories dot the landscape, and you see at the same time the demise of that small family farm. This doesn't happen overnight, okay? But that small, self-sufficient family farm slowly dies. Okay, so interestingly enough, one of the first factory systems that formed happened in western part of Massachusetts here, and you can see where some of these factories were located. Okay, and this is in the late 1830s. And again, this is something new in our economic history. And a lot of factory owners are experimenting, so to say, on what kind of labor force should they hire, where should they seek this labor force, right? Because there's still some self-sufficient farmers out there, right? Family farms. So what they did is decide in the factories around Waltham and Lowell in Massachusetts, they decide to employ young women. Okay, and they specifically looked for this labor source in the rural areas. Okay, not Boston, but in the rural areas. So this would constitute one of the first labor forces in the United States. Young women, employed to work in a factory. They all lived in the same dormitory, right? And these young women were attracted to the fact that they were going to gain a wage, however small it was, right? But yeah, that was attractive to them, that they would make some money and even gain some independence from the patriarchal household of the typical agrarian household where the father ruled absolutely, right? That patriarchal system. So this was attractive to many of the factory women. They called these women the factory girls, okay? And not only did they serve as an early precursor to this labor force, right, but also they would go on to protest the conditions that they found themselves in, especially in the workplace, as well as the very small wage that they were paid. Okay, they were paid a mere pittance, hardly self-sufficient, right, for any wage worker. And not only that, the conditions in the factory, things we take for granted today due to the labor movement, right? Things like breaks and 5-day work weeks, 8 hours a day, so forth, right? Back then, they didn't have any of those standards or guidelines or regulations set. Again, this is the very beginning of industrialization in the country. So these women would be known as forerunners or precursors to the labor movement, right? And they happen to be young women. And that's why they deserve this place in American history, right? We're talking about the working class here. All right, so this takes us to the effect of the market revolution in the North. Okay, and some of this we already kind of went over, but we need to just to discuss a little bit further. Um, First thing, the transition from family farm, which we use the term subsistence farming, but there was also a form of farming called subsistence plus farming. You may recall this going back to the Puritans, right? And the whole notion behind subsistence plus farming is that sure, you grew for your family's self sustenance, right? But you also grew extra for the market. You could sell, right, to those in business, commerce, that they would in turn sell that grain for a profit, right? So in a way, you're mixed in with the market. It's not purely self-sufficient, right? That you see in the feudal period, for example, in feudalism, right? The Middle Ages. Here, you're thinking about the market already, right? Might as well grow some extra, right? And make some extra money to those who are involved in, commercial selling of food, of grains, so to speak. Okay, so by the way, there's also a form of farming that's just producing one thing. And again, we discussed this with the plantation system in Virginia, for example, the tobacco plantation. You're just growing one thing. It's called monocrop agriculture. And, the simple fact that you're growing one thing means that you're not thinking about the family's self subsistence, right? No, you're thinking about going for the market only because the family needs diversified farming. You can't just eat one thing, right? So the fact that you're growing one thing means your sole aim is to produce for the market again, right? So we keep emphasizing market over and over here, right? All right. Now, another effect in the North is something that happens and, it doesn't happen overnight again, but it does pick up gradually is this migration from the rural areas towards the urban um, areas where the cities are, where the factories are emerging, right? You have to think about eventually these big industrial cities like Chicago and Pittsburgh and Boston, New York, right? So basically, what's happening is, these the rural class, agricultural class, eventually decide that, well, for one thing, their land becomes more expensive because of the marketization of land. It becomes uh, higher, right? The cost to hang on to it becomes higher because of the precipitous rise in land prices. So some of them are forced to let go of their land. And how are you going to, seek new employment? Well, you go to the city, all right, and work in a factory. And by the way, in areas of the world today, as we speak, that are undergoing industrialization, let's say China is still going through their industrial revolution, right? You see this happening. You see Chinese peasants migrating from the rural parts of China to the urban parts to work in the factories, right? Okay, so this happened in our country in the market revolution period. Another thing that happens is the formation of the working class. I just mentioned them in reference to the Waltham or Lowell factory girls. And working class here in this context means something very specific. It refers to those employees working in the factory system. Okay, that's what we mean by working class. Today, it means widely construed as anyone who just works a sort of a dead end job sometimes, or in retail where there's very little mobility, right? Sometimes it's even menial work, right? Or just working with your hands, right? And they refer to that as working class, so to speak, right? Well, back then it meant something very specific. It means working in the factory. Okay. And the last thing that has an effect in the North is the nature of labor itself. Okay, when we think about human beings, we have to labor in order to survive. We have to expend labor, whether we're talking about nomadic hunter-gatherers or, agriculturalists or in a factory, right? Now, um, nature, the nature of labor, excuse me, changes drastically when you see the formation of the working class. Why? It's because previous to the factory system, it was assumed that, you know, anything you worked with your own two hands and you, quote, mixed your labor in making that thing. Let's imagine a seamstress again, right? He or she is making clothing and it belongs to them, right? Because they expended their labor and they created this commodity, right, for the market. This good, economic goods. Okay, now in the factory system, think about this. Do the workers, the working class that is, within that factory, own the final product of their labor? Well, the answer is no. Who owns it? The factory worker. Okay, so here's a drastic change in the nature of labor when we compare, the factory system or the market system as compared to, let's say, the feudal era. Okay, that is, you don't own the products you make with your own two hands. Okay, in a factory system, what's happening is the factory owner is finding wage workers as his employees, and they're being paid very little, as I mentioned earlier, right? But the final product made in the factory obviously is owned by the factory worker who's going to sell it for a profit, right? So this is very drastic. You have to think about this. When you get a job, even today, let alone back then, when you exchange your labor, so to say, for a wage, that's a transaction on the market, just like any other commodity on the market. Okay, you are exchanging your labor, and you're signing a contract, right? When you first get hired, you agree to exchange your labor for X amount of wage, right? And again, I have to emphasize that is, uh, um, an agreement, right? And it doesn't mean in that contract that you own, right, that product of your labor. Now, to us, it seems so self-evident, so obvious, right? But back then, if you happened to be alive when this was happening, it was almost counterintuitive and maybe even nonsensical to think about the fact that you're making all this stuff with your own labor, your own two hands, but you don't own it. Rather, instead of owning it, you make a wage. And again, this is the change in the nature of labor that's happening in the North. Okay, so how does all these changes affect the American family and even gender roles? Well, here we see a couple of things associated with it, with the market revolution, with the advent of the market penetrating, all aspects of life. Well, you see the decline of the patriarchal household for one thing, okay, and this you associate with that family farm where father is in charge, right? He's the authority, the ultimate authority. Well, you start seeing more individualism when you see, for example, those Lowell factory girls, right? They're starting to make their own wage. They're achieving autonomy and independence, right? They're even, if you will, crystallizing their form of identity with the sisterhood among them, right? So it's away from that agrarian-based patriarchal household that had been around for a long time. I'm not saying that it disappears, the patriarchal worldview, but it's just, the household itself starts to erode. You also see, in terms of gender roles, separate spheres, and that's the notion that the home is divided into spheres in the market system. The home is the preserve of women, right? Why? Because they're thought to be the guardians of the home, right? Moral guardians, raising their kids, but even doing domestic duty, and this connects with the cult of domesticity mentioned below. And then the men, on the other hand, are believed to be the ones to go out in that competitive world of work and get a job. So that's how you see the separate spheres of the gender, right? Women stay at home, men work, and when they stay at home, they adhere to the cult of domesticity, right? They do all the domestic work like cleaning, raising kids, and all that stuff, cooking, and what have you. And possessive individual refers to this, that it's about the individual, right? As I just mentioned in relation to the decline of patriarchal household. You own yourself. You are free. That's what possessive means. You own yourself. You are free. And society starts becoming based on the individual over the collective. In agrarian societies, you emphasize the collective. In a market society, you individualize the individual, you look at the individual.